So intermittent activities, so games, so depending on what sport it is, but mainly sports like football and basketball, medium intensity and medium to low duration. They use slow oxidative and fast glycolytic muscle fibers, and probably use all the systems if there aren't regular pauses. But if there are, like timeouts in basketball, for example, this gives a chance for the systems to resynthesize ATP. So when the athlete goes again, they start off by using the ATP again. So lactate could be a waste product in these events. Therefore, if there are natural pauses in the game, the athlete can continue to work anaerobically as they can resynthesize their aerobic stores ready to be used again. An increase in the concentration of hydrogen ions and the increased acidity causes a decrease in the conduction velocity of muscle fibers, a decrease in the peak twitch tension, corresponding decrease in firing frequency, and a decrease in force. Fast twitch motor units also drop out first as they need a higher frequency of impulse stimulation. During intermittent activities, neuromuscular fatigue has an impact as there is a reduction in calcium ions released as part of the sliding filament theory. Calcium ions are known to be released, allowing actin and myosin to couple and form actomyosin. If the stores of calcium ions is reduced, the ability of actin and myosin to couple is compromised, therefore preventing continued muscle contractions, and they become weak. Another neuromuscular cause of fatigue is the depletion of acetylcholine, as this is a neurotransmitter released to stimulate the skeletal muscles and the parasympathetic nervous system. Its effect is short-lived because it is destroyed by the acetylcholine esterase, which is an enzyme released into the sarcoplasm of muscle fibers to prevent continued muscle contractions in the absence of additional nervous stimulation. Cholinesterase can either deplete or there will be excess, as it's an enzyme that breaks down ACH after this role and prepares it to be used again. When there is excess ACH or a lack of cholinesterase, fatigue results from the inability to generate a new action potential. Byproducts from game sports are mainly heat, as this is normally 80%, but high intensity of exercise, and when the environmental temperatures or humidity are elevated, there can be a significant increase in body core temperature, which is hypothermia, that can cause fatigue and in extreme cases death. So strategies to reduce or avoid fatigue in game sports could be pre-cooling, as by ingesting slushy or external cooling can reduce temperature during exercise. As you can see in the graph, that the black squares are pre-cooling and they show that the mean skin temperature is reduced, although performance, whereas the control of preheating is much higher. Another strategy is hydration, as you can see in the graph, because consuming fluids reduces the temperature over time. As you can see, no fluids at 120 minutes is around 40 degrees, and with fluids it's around 38.8 degrees. Also in the graph about hydration and carbohydrates, it shows that all decrease in performance, but least with carbs, and after this following just with water. Therefore, keeping hydrated in sports games is a critical strategy in becoming less fatigued but also sustain a higher performance. Recovery, so the intensity and duration of the sport event mostly determines the recovery time, as well as other factors like the fuels used, energy systems that are used, and in addition waste products that are used and how the body uses them. So during events at high intensity like the shot put, the recovery time is very short as ATP is only used. Therefore, the aerobic system uses oxygen to produce energy to resynthesize the ADP back to ATP ready to be used again. Then events that are still high intensity and short duration like the 100-meter race but longer than the maximal throw. This again uses the aerobic system and oxygen to produce energy to resynthesize the ADP and ADP to ATP, as well as the phosphate and creatine back to phosphocreatine. This takes approximately 3 to 4 liters of oxygen, and 50% of the phosphocreatine is restored in 30 seconds. 75% of phosphocreatine is restored in 1 minute, and 100% is stored around 3 minutes. So looking at this epoch graph, for maximal exercise. Firstly, to state what things are in the graph. So the area in white is the amount of oxygen we manage to take on board whilst doing exercise. The area above this is the oxygen deficit, which is the amount of oxygen failed to get on board during the event. The area on the right is epoch, which is consuming oxygen after exercise, which contains three components: the alactic recovery, the lactic acid recovery, and the metabolic needs, which I'll talk about in more detail depending on the activity. And lastly, the area underneath is how much oxygen we normally consume. Now specifically linking this to the graph itself, which is maximal intensity, we know when someone's in epoch when they are breathing faster and deeper after exercise. So looking at the graph, there is a large oxygen deficit which shows that loss of oxygen was failed to get on board during the event. There is no steady state, which shows the athlete can't gain as much oxygen they need. Anaerobic respiration, which means um, there's more lactic acid and a larger epoch. Specifically in the epoch for high intensity activities, the alactic fast recovery is essential as this makes the recovery time very short. The VO2 consumed resaturates myoglobin with oxygen, resaturates hemoglobin with oxygen, and resynthesizes the ATP and phosphocreatine stores. Specifically, the myoglobin combined with the oxygen ready to take oxygen to the mitochondria when exercise begins again. Approximately 0.5 liters of oxygen for 100% recovery, and it takes around 1 to 2 minutes. So then events that are moderate intensity and moderate duration, like the 400 meters, uses aerobic system again, using oxygen to get rid of the lactic acid, where 65% is converted into pyruvate and enters Krebs and is ultimately converted to CO2 and H2O. 5% is converted into glucose in the Cori cycle in the liver. 20% is converted into glycogen in the liver and stored in the muscles and liver, and 10% is converted into protein. Events like this take around 2 hours to recover from. So looking at this submaximal exercise epoch graph, we can see that there is a smaller oxygen deficit, which means more oxygen was able to get on board. There is a steady state, which shows that the athlete is able to use the right amount of oxygen for the activity, and the VO2 stays the same. It's mostly aerobic respiration, so there is less lactic acid. During events like this in epoch, it uses the alactic recovery, lactic acid, lactate, lactic acid recovery, and metabolic needs, where the alactic recovery is the same as maximal, and the alactic acid recovery removes CO2, lactic acid, and replenishes muscle glycogen stores. Increased cardiac output and ventilation helps to remove high levels of CO2. 70% is carried into the plasma and carbonic acid, 23% is carried into the hemoglobin and carbohemoglobin, and 7% is dissolved into the plasma. Metabolic needs is the energy needed for the respiratory muscles to keep the heart rate and breathing rate elevated to recover. This lactic acid recovery graph shows that the oxygen debt takes around 1 hour until it's 100% repaired. DOMS also links in here for the type of activity this stands for delayed onset of muscle soreness and is caused by the myofibrils tears from eccentric exercise. It leads to an inflammatory response which could be swelling and pain 24 to 48 hours after exercise. Muscle strength and motion is impaired, and light movements as passive stretching can help. Then for prolonged low intensity aerobic exercise like a marathon, muscle glycogen restorations can take days, as well as overall recovery in general from events like this. The factors within EBOC are the same, however there are more of everything, as you can imagine, because the event is longer and harder. For example, in the alactic recovery, there will be more myoglobin and hemoglobin to resaturate, as well as taking longer to resynthesize ATP and PC stores as must resynthesize all the stores. Then in the alactic recovery, there will be lots more CO2 and lactic acid to remove, as well as the metabolic needs having to keep everything elevated during recovery. Therefore, the process is the same, but with longer duration events that fatigue more. The recovery time frame is a lot longer. Recovery from intermittent activity is very dependent on the activity itself, because if the activity naturally has lots of breaks, the recovery will be faster, and if an athlete is working 100% all the time, then they will need these rest breaks to recover. Whereas if the game doesn't have a lot of breaks, it will be longer to recover due to a larger epoch. For example, recovery from a basketball won't be too long, maybe a couple of hours, depending on how much the player played in the game. So strategies to aid recovery could include nutrition, because high carb diets can speed up glycogen recovery process, as fat glycolytic fibers can be restored faster than slow oxidative. To accelerate recovery, consume around 300 to 400 calories of carbohydrates shortly after training session. Other strategies could include getting a massage or having an active cool down, as this aids dissipation of waste products and reduces the potential of DOMS. There are also mental strategies. An athlete could meditate or control their breathing. Overtraining could have a big impact on recovery as well as performance levels. As you can see in the graph, it shows that when overreaching and under recovery, performance decreases, and then overtraining can cause serious under recover and dramatic reductions in performance. Symptoms of overtraining could include underperformance, physiological changes like weight loss, mood and sleep disturbances. Therefore, overtraining can have a serious effect on how the body recovers, as you are constantly working and not giving the body time to recover. Overall recovery is dependent on the intensity and duration of the event and what systems are used and what needs to be resynthesized and resaturated.